In 53 years of law, I handled murders, I handled fraud, I handled cases that made national headlines. But if you want to know what truly destroys people, it's not the big crimes. It's land, a piece of dirt, a fence line, a driveway, a tree that grows 2 inches over someone's property. I've seen brothers stop speaking forever over a half-acre of grass. I've seen million-dollar families torn apart over a garden wall. And I've seen one case, this case, where a property dispute between 2 neighbors on a quiet suburban street in Ohio ended with 1 man dead, 1 man in prison, and an entire family destroyed. All over 14 feet of land. 14 feet. I want you to remember that number. On the evening of August 17, 2009, a neighbor called 911 from Sycamore Lane in Dayton, Ohio. She was whispering into the phone, hiding behind her kitchen curtains. She said, "Something is happening next door. There's screaming. I think someone has a gun." By the time officers arrived, 7 minutes later, Thomas Grady, 58 years old, was lying face down in his own driveway. 2 bullets, close range. His neighbor, Frank Carlson, 61 years old, was sitting calmly on his porch steps, hands on his knees, the gun on the ground beside him. When the first officer approached and asked, "Sir, did you shoot this man?" Frank Carlson looked up and said, "He had it coming. That land was mine. It was always mine." Now, before you judge Frank Carlson, I need you to understand everything that led to that moment. Because this story doesn't start with a gunshot. It starts 11 years earlier, with a handshake. 1998, Sycamore Lane, Dayton, Ohio. A quiet street, nice houses, good people. Frank Carlson had lived there since 1987. Retired electrician, widower, kept his lawn perfect, knew every neighbor by name. Everyone liked Frank. Thomas Grady moved in next door in 1998. Younger man, 47 at the time. Sales manager at a manufacturing company. Married to Linda Grady. 2 teenage kids. Friendly family. Friendly enough. For the first year, everything was fine. Cookouts. Borrowed tools. Waved from the driveway. Frank told me later, Tom was a good neighbor in the beginning. I genuinely liked him. But in the spring of 1999, Thomas Grady decided he wanted to expand his driveway. Widen it. Add a second lane so his kids could park there when they got older. The problem? The expansion would push right up against the property line. Or so Thomas thought was the property line. He called the city. Got an informal estimate from a contractor friend. Looked at an old survey map. And he started pouring concrete. Frank Carlson walked over and said, "Tom, I think you're on my land." Thomas laughed. Genuinely laughed. He said, "Frank, I checked. It's fine. Relax." Frank let it go. He shouldn't have. For 7 years, the driveway sat there. Nobody thought much about it. But in 2006, Frank Carlson decided to sell his house. His kids lived in Seattle. He was getting older. He wanted to move closer to his grandchildren. He hired a real estate agent. The agent ordered a professional land survey, standard procedure before any sale. The surveyor came out on a Wednesday morning in April. He measured. He measured again. Then he knocked on Frank's door and said, "Mr. Carlson, your neighbor's driveway is sitting 14 inches over your property line. Not 14 feet. 14 inches. But in property law, an inch is an inch." Frank went to Thomas that same evening, calmly, reasonably. He said, "Tom, the survey shows your driveway crosses onto my land. I need you to correct it before I sell." Thomas Grady looked at him and said, "That survey is wrong." Frank said, "It's a licensed professional survey, Tom." Thomas said, "Get off my property." That was the last civil conversation these 2 men ever had. Frank hired me 3 weeks later. I want to tell you something about property disputes that most people don't understand. They are the most emotionally explosive cases in civil law. More than divorce. Sometimes more than criminal cases. Because a man's home, his land, that's not just property. That's his identity. His safety. His legacy. When you threaten a man's land, you threaten him. Frank Carlson was a reasonable man when he walked into my office. But I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just about 14 inches anymore. This was about respect. About being dismissed. About being lied to. We filed a civil complaint in June 2006. Simple encroachment case. Straightforward. Normally, these cases settle in weeks. Neighbor moves the driveway, pays a small fee, everybody moves on. Thomas Grady hired his own attorney. And instead of settling, he countersued. He claimed the land had been his through adverse possession, a legal doctrine that says if you openly use someone else's land for long enough without objection, you can claim ownership. 7 years of use. That was his argument. It was a stretch, a real stretch, but it wasn't impossible. And just like that, a 14-inch driveway dispute became a full-blown property lawsuit. The legal fees started piling up. For both men, Frank couldn't sell his house. The disputed survey created a title issue. His move to Seattle was on hold indefinitely. Thomas Grady meanwhile started making Frank's life difficult in every way he legally, and sometimes illegally, could. He installed floodlights on his garage that shone directly into Frank's bedroom windows. He let his grass grow wild on the shared fence side. He filed noise complaints against Frank, 3 of them in 4 months, all dismissed. He let his dog run into Frank's yard and tear up his garden. Frank documented everything. Photographs, dates, times, written logs. He brought them to me every month like clockwork. Neat little folders, handwritten labels. I told him, "Frank, you are building an excellent legal record." He said, "Harold, I am losing my mind." The civil case dragged on for 2 years. Court dates delayed. Continuances filed. Thomas Grady's attorney was good, I'll give him that. He knew how to slow things down. Every delay cost Frank more money, more time, more stress. His house sat unsold. His grandchildren were growing up in Seattle without him. In early 2008, the judge ruled against Thomas Grady's adverse possession claim. The land legally belonged to Frank. Thomas was ordered to remove or relocate the encroaching portion of his driveway within 90 days. Frank called me after the ruling. He was almost in tears, happy tears. He said, "Harold, it's finally over." I said, "Frank, wait for the 90 days. Don't celebrate yet." I knew men like Thomas Grady. A court order wasn't going to end this. The 90 days passed. Thomas Grady did not move the driveway. We filed for contempt. The court fined him $500 per day until he complied. Thomas Grady paid the first week of fines, then stopped paying. We went back to court. The judge was furious. He threatened jail time. Thomas Grady finally hired a contractor to cut back the driveway. The work was done on a Thursday afternoon in March 2009. Frank Carlson watched from his window. When the contractor left, Thomas Grady walked to his fence, looked directly at Frank's window, and made a gesture I won't describe in detail. Frank told me about it the next day. He said, "Harold, that man hates me. Real hate, not neighbor hate, something darker." I told Frank to put his house back on the market, settle the legal fees, move to Seattle, get away from this man. Frank listed the house in April 2009. He had a buyer by July. Closing date, September 1st, 2009. It was almost over. Almost. 2 weeks before closing, August 17th, 2009. A Sunday evening. Frank was in his backyard, packing boxes, getting ready to finally leave. Thomas Grady came to the shared fence line. He had been drinking. The toxicology report confirmed a blood alcohol level of 0.14. He started shouting over the fence. Neighbors later told police they could hear him from 3 houses away. He was screaming about the lawsuit, about the legal fees, about how Frank had ruined him. He said, "You think you won? You destroyed my family over a piece of dirt. Now here's what's important." Frank Carlson did not shout back. 2 witnesses confirmed this. Frank walked toward the fence and said, calmly, "Tom, I'm moving in 2 weeks. It's done. Go inside." Thomas Grady reached into his waistband. Frank saw the gun and ran. He made it to his driveway. Thomas Grady climbed the fence. He shot Thomas. "Frank, I'm sorry." He shot Frank Carlson twice in the back as he ran. Frank fell face down in his own driveway, 14 feet from his own front door. Thomas Grady then walked back to his porch, sat down, and waited for the police. This was not a complicated investigation. Thomas Grady never denied shooting Frank Carlson. The gun was registered to him, his prints, his weapon. 2 eyewitnesses saw everything. But the defense tried something interesting. They argued emotional disturbance. Extreme emotional disturbance. The years of litigation, The financial ruin. The stress. They said Thomas Grady snapped. That this wasn't premeditated murder, it was a man pushed past his breaking point. It was a reasonable argument, honestly. The legal fees had cost Thomas Grady over $190,000. His wife had left him in 2008, she cited the obsession with the lawsuit. His kids barely spoke to him. The defense painted a picture of a man who had lost everything, not because he was evil, but because a legal system had ground him down until he broke. My job was to show the jury something different. Frank Carlson survived. Barely. One bullet had missed his spine by less than an inch. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital. 2 surgeries. He walked with a cane for the rest of his life. He never made it to Seattle. The trauma, physical and psychological, made the move impossible. He sold his house from a hospital bed. Closed on September 1st, just like planned. But he moved to his daughter's spare bedroom in Columbus instead. Frank testified at trial. He walked in slowly with his cane, sat down carefully. The jury watched every painful step. I asked him one question on direct examination. Just one. I said, "Mr. Carlson, in your own words, what did you want from Thomas Grady?" Frank thought for a moment. Then he said, "I just wanted what was mine. That's all I ever wanted." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty. Second-degree murder, reduced from first-degree on the emotional disturbance argument. Thomas Grady was sentenced to 22 years in prison. With his age, 61 at sentencing, the judge looked him in the eye and said, "Mr. Grady, there is a reasonable chance you will die in this facility." Thomas Grady showed no emotion. His ex-wife was not in the courtroom. His children were not in the courtroom. Nobody came for him. Frank Carlson was in the front row. When the verdict was read, he nodded once, slowly. Same as Rebecca's mother in the Mercer case. I've seen that nod before. It doesn't mean happy. It means, finally. I visited Frank 2 years after the trial. He was living in Columbus. Small apartment. Comfortable enough. He had photographs of his grandchildren on every wall. He showed me one, a little girl, maybe 4 years old, sitting on his lap. He said, "She calls me Grandpa Frank." First person who's called me that. I thought about 14 inches of concrete. And what it cost 2 men. Everything. Thomas Grady wanted to win so badly, that he forgot what he was losing. Property, money, pride. These things will make people do things that no sane person plans to do. I've seen it 100 times. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. No piece of land is worth your freedom. No argument is worth your life. Walk away. Hire a lawyer. Let the courts decide. That's what they're there for. I'm Harold Whitmore. 53 years in law. And I'll tell you, the saddest cases I ever saw were the ones that never had to happen. I'll see you in the next one.